In the darkest hours of World War II, when the world burned under the weight of violence and destruction, there emerged a man who would defy every expectation placed upon him. He carried no gun into battle, wielded no grenades, and fired no bullets at the enemy. Instead, he brought with him something the other soldiers mocked, something they laughed at, something they believed had no place on a modern battlefield where machine guns roared and artillery shells tore the earth apart. He carried a bow, a simple wooden bow, the kind of weapon that seemed to belong in history books rather than in the hands of a soldier fighting the most technologically advanced war humanity had ever seen. His fellow soldiers ridiculed him, called him foolish, questioned his sanity, and wondered how long he would survive once the real fighting began. They saw him as a curiosity, a strange medical officer who clung to an outdated weapon like a child refusing to let go of a favorite toy. But they had no idea what this man was capable of. They could not have imagined that within 3 days of combat, this mocked medical officer would become a legend, that his bow would sing through the air with deadly precision, and that 7 German sergeants would fall before his arrows, never knowing what had struck them down. This is the story of a man who proved that courage comes in many forms, that skill transcends technology, and that sometimes the most unlikely warrior becomes the most deadly. The man who would one day strike fear into the hearts of German soldiers was born into a world far removed from the battlefields of Europe. He grew up in the quiet countryside of England, in a small village where life moved at the gentle pace of the seasons, and the loudest sounds were the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves in the ancient forests that surrounded his home. His father was a country doctor, a man who believed in healing rather than hurting, and who taught his son that the greatest strength a person could possess was the ability to help others in their time of need. But his grandfather was different. His grandfather was an old man who remembered the ways of the past, who had learned archery as a boy, and who believed that the skills of the ancestors should never be forgotten even as the modern world rushed forward with its machines and its guns and its belief that technology could solve every problem. The boy spent countless hours with his grandfather in the fields and forests, learning to string a bow, to judge the wind, to feel the weight of an arrow in his fingers, and to release it with perfect timing so that it flew true to its target. His grandfather taught him that archery was not just about hitting a target, but about patience, about breathing, about becoming one with the weapon, and understanding that every shot required complete focus and absolute calm. The boy learned these lessons well, practicing day after day until his arms ached and his fingers were raw from the bowstring, until the bow became an extension of his own body and shooting became as natural as walking or breathing. While other children his age played with toy soldiers and dreamed of driving tanks or flying planes, this boy found his joy in the quiet concentration of archery, in the satisfying thunk of an arrow hitting its mark, in the knowledge that he was mastering a skill that few others bothered to learn anymore. His father wanted him to become a doctor, like himself, to follow in the family tradition of healing and helping others, and the boy respected this wish because he loved his father and understood the importance of medicine. He studied hard in school, learned about anatomy and biology, read medical books that were far too advanced for someone his age, and showed a natural aptitude for understanding how the human body worked and how to treat its ailments. But he never stopped practicing with his bow. Even as he grew older and began his medical training, even as he learned to set broken bones and stitch wounds and diagnose illnesses, he still made time every week to go into the forest with his bow and arrows, to maintain the skills his grandfather had taught him, to keep alive this ancient art that most people considered obsolete and useless in the modern age. When war came to Europe in 1939, the world changed overnight. The peaceful countryside where the young man had grown up suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed as news arrived of German armies sweeping across Poland, of cities being bombed, of millions of people being displaced and killed. Britain prepared for war, calling up young men to join the military and defend their homeland against the Nazi threat that seemed unstoppable. The young medical student, now in his early 20s, faced a difficult decision. His father urged him to continue his medical studies, to become a doctor who could help the wounded and save lives, arguing that healers would be just as important as fighters in the terrible conflict that was coming. But the young man felt a different calling. He could not stand by and study books while his countrymen went off to fight and die. He felt a duty to serve, to put himself in danger alongside the others, to use whatever skills he had to help win the war. He enlisted in the British Army as a medical officer, a role that satisfied both his desire to serve and his father's wish that he use his medical knowledge to help others. The Army welcomed him because trained medical personnel were needed desperately, and they sent him to a training camp where he learned military procedures, how to treat battlefield wounds, how to move wounded soldiers to safety, and how to work under the terrible pressure of combat conditions where every second could mean the difference between life and death. He was a good medical officer, dedicated and skilled, and his superiors quickly recognized his competence and his calm demeanor under stress. But he brought something else with him to the military camp, something that set him apart from every other medical officer in the British Army. He brought his bow. When his fellow soldiers first saw him practicing with his bow during his free time, they thought it was a joke. They gathered around to watch, laughing and making comments about how he had accidentally joined the wrong army, how perhaps he was confused and thought he was going to fight in medieval times rather than in World War II. They asked him if he planned to challenge German tanks to jousting matches, or if he intended to storm machine gun nests, armed only with arrows. The mockery was constant and cruel, and some of the other officers suggested that he should leave his ridiculous toy at home and focus on his medical duties instead of embarrassing himself with outdated weapons. But the young man did not respond to his taunts with anger or defensiveness. He simply continued practicing, continued perfecting his aim, continued maintaining his equipment with the same dedication he brought to his medical studies. Deep inside, he knew something that the others did not. He knew that his bow might seem like a relic from the past, but in the right hands and in the right situation, it could be just as deadly as any modern weapon. In 1942, the young medical officer received orders that would change his life forever. He was being sent to North Africa to join British forces fighting against the German Afrika Korps, led by the legendary General Rommel. The Desert War was brutal and unforgiving, a campaign fought across vast stretches of sand, where temperatures soared during the day and plummeted at night, where water was scarce and every battle was a desperate struggle for survival. The young medical officer packed his medical supplies carefully, making sure he had everything he would need to treat the wounded soldiers who would depend on him in the coming months. And then, despite all the mockery he had endured, despite all the advice to leave it behind, he packed his bow and a quiver of specially made arrows that he had crafted himself during his training. The journey to North Africa was long and dangerous. German submarines prowled the Mediterranean, hunting for Allied ships to sink, and every sailor and soldier aboard the transport vessels knew that they might never reach their destination. The young medical officer spent the voyage preparing mentally for what lay ahead, reading medical manuals, talking with other officers about what to expect in combat, and occasionally going up on deck to practice drawing his bow when no one was watching. He thought about his grandfather, who had passed away just before the war began, and he remembered the old man's words about how true skill never becomes obsolete, about how a warrior who masters his weapon can accomplish things that seem impossible to others. These memories gave him comfort and strength as the ship sailed closer to the war zone. When they finally arrived in North Africa, the heat hit them like a physical force. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape, and even the most experienced soldiers struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions. The young medical officer was assigned to a forward unit that operated close to the front lines, providing immediate medical care to wounded soldiers before they could be evacuated to larger field hospitals further behind. It was dangerous work that required him to move quickly through combat zones, to work while bullets flew overhead, and to make life-or-death decisions in moments when there was no time to think or hesitate. He proved himself capable and brave, earning the respect of the soldiers he served, who came to trust his skill and appreciate his calm presence during the chaos of battle. For weeks, the young medical officer performed his duties without incident, treating wounded men, saving lives, and occasionally dodging enemy fire as he worked. His bow remained with his personal equipment, still drawing occasional jokes from soldiers who passed by his tent and saw it leaning against his cot. But everything changed one night when German forces launched a surprise attack on the British position. The attack came in darkness, with German infantry moving silently through the desert, trying to infiltrate the British lines and create chaos before the main assault began. Sentries were killed quietly, communications were cut, and confusion spread through the British camp as soldiers realized they were under attack but could not tell where the enemy was or how many there were. The young medical officer was awakened by the sounds of fighting nearby, the sharp crack of rifles and the shouts of men engaged in close combat. He grabbed his medical bag by instinct, preparing to rush out and help the wounded soldiers, but something made him pause. He heard voices speaking German very close to his tent, and he realized that enemy soldiers had penetrated deep into the British position. If he went outside unarmed, he would be captured or killed, and he would be unable to help anyone. For a moment he stood frozen, his medical training telling him to stay out of combat, to focus on healing rather than fighting. But then he thought of all the soldiers who depended on him, all the men who would die if the German attack succeeded, and he made a decision that went against everything he had been trained as a medical officer. He reached for his bow. His hands moved automatically, stringing it with practiced ease even in the darkness of the tent, selecting arrows from his quiver and checking their condition by touch. He could hear the German soldiers moving outside, could hear them speaking to each other in urgent whispers as they searched the camp for British officers and important equipment. He knew that he had only seconds to act, that if he hesitated he would lose his chance and possibly his life. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, drawing on all the years of training with his grandfather, all the hours of practice in the forests of England, he stepped out of his tent with his bow drawn and ready. What happened next would become legend among the British soldiers who survived that night. The young medical officer emerged from his tent to find himself facing 3 German sergeants who were moving through the camp with their weapons ready. In the dim night of the desert stars, they saw him and raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the medical officer released his first arrow. The bowstring sang in the night air, a sound so quiet and unexpected that the Germans did not even recognize it as a threat. The arrow flew true, striking the first sergeant in the chest and dropping him instantly without a sound. The other 2 Germans stared in confusion, not understanding what had happened, looking around for the source of the gunshot they expected to hear. But there had been no gunshot, only that strange whisper of air that meant nothing to them. The medical officer had already knocked his second arrow before the first German hit the ground. He drew and released in one smooth motion, the product of thousands of hours of practice in the forests of England, and the second sergeant fell beside the first. Now the third German understood that he was under attack, and he swung his rifle toward the shadowy figure with the bow, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he was too slow. The third arrow was already in flight, and it took him in the throat, silencing him before he could cry out a warning to his comrades. In less than 10 seconds, 3 German sergeants lay dead, and the British medical officer stood among them with his bow still raised, his heart pounding, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. He had killed 3 men. As a medical officer, as someone trained to save lives,
The weight of this action crashed down on him like a physical burden. But there was no time to think about the moral implications, no time to question his choices. He could still hear German voices in the camp, could still hear the sounds of fighting as British soldiers struggled against the infiltrators. Moving quickly and silently, he retrieved his arrows from the fallen Germans, wiping them clean and returning them to his quiver. Then he moved through the camp like a ghost, using every skill his grandfather taught him about moving silently through forests, applying those lessons to the desert battlefield.
During his time back in England, he visited the forest where his grandfather had taught him to shoot. The trees seemed smaller than he remembered, the distances shorter, the targets he had practiced on as a boy now looking almost comically easy compared to the challenges he had faced in combat. He stood in a clearing where he had spent countless hours as a child, where his grandfather had patiently corrected his form and taught him to feel the rhythm of the bow, and he felt the old man's presence so strongly that he could almost hear his voice on the wind. He drew his bow one more time in that forest, aiming at an old target that still hung from a tree, and he released an arrow that flew true and struck dead center just as it always had. In that moment, he felt a connection to something larger than himself, a sense that the skills passed down through generations had served a purpose beyond anything his grandfather could have imagined. The young medical officer's rest in England was brief. The war continued to rage across Europe and the Pacific, and experienced medical personnel were desperately needed on multiple fronts. He received new orders assigning him to support operations in Europe, where Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of France that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. He said goodbye to his father once again, not knowing if he would survive this next phase of the war, and he shipped out with thousands of other soldiers who were committed to seeing the fight through to final victory. His service in Europe was different from his time in North Africa. The fighting was even more intense, the casualties even higher, and the stakes even greater as Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territory. He worked in field hospitals just behind the front lines, treating an endless stream of wounded soldiers who came back from battles with names that would echo through history. His bow went with him, though he had fewer opportunities to use it in the kind of close-quarters situations where it proved most effective. The warfare in Europe involved more set-piece battles, more artillery bombardments, more mechanized combat that left less room for the silent and personal nature of archery. But there were still moments when his unique skills proved valuable. There were nighttime operations where silence was essential, reconnaissance missions where a quiet kill could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure, and desperate situations where any weapon that could strike the enemy was welcome. He used his bow sparingly, and always with the same careful precision that had characterized his first combat experience in North Africa. Each arrow he released in anger was a deliberate choice, a calculated decision to take a life in service of saving others, and he never allowed himself to become casual or callous about this responsibility. As the war in Europe drew toward its conclusion, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, and the Nazi regime began to crumble, the young medical officer who had once been mocked for his bow had become a decorated veteran whose service record spoke of both healing and fighting. He had saved countless lives through his medical skills, had earned the respect and gratitude of hundreds of soldiers who owed their survival to his competence and dedication. And he had taken lives when necessary, always with reluctance, but never with hesitation when he believed the situation demanded it. When Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, ending the war in Europe, he felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. The purpose that had driven him for years, the clear sense of fighting for something important and necessary, suddenly disappeared. He was still a young man, barely 30 years old, but he felt ancient and worn down by everything he had witnessed and experienced. The boy who had learned archery in the peaceful English countryside seemed like a different person, someone from another lifetime, innocent and untouched by the realities of human violence and suffering. He returned to England once more, this time with no expectation of being sent back into combat.
The war with Japan continued for a few more months until the atomic bombs brought that conflict to its terrible conclusion, but he was not called upon to serve in the Pacific. Instead, he remained in England and began the difficult process of transitioning back to civilian life, of trying to find his place in a world that was no longer at war. Many veterans struggled with this transition, finding it impossible to reconnect with normal life after years of combat. But the young medical officer had his profession to return to. Medicine gave him purpose and direction, a way to continue helping others and using his skills for healing rather than harm. He completed his medical training and became a fully qualified doctor, establishing a practice in a small town not far from where he had grown up. His patients knew that he had served in the war, that he had been decorated for bravery, but he rarely spoke about his experiences unless directly asked. He focused on his work, on treating illnesses and injuries, on bringing new lives into the world and comforting the dying in their final hours. He married a nurse he had worked with during the war, a woman who understood what he had been through because she had been there too, had seen the same horrors and carried similar burdens. Together, they built a quiet life focused on family and community service, deliberately choosing peace and normalcy after years of chaos and violence. But he never stopped practicing with his bow. It remained an important part of his life, though now he shot only at targets and never at human beings. He joined an archery club and competed in tournaments, winning numerous championships and becoming known in archery circles as one of the finest bowmen in England. Young people came to him for lessons, and he taught them as his grandfather had taught him, emphasizing patience and discipline and the importance of mastering your craft through dedicated practice. He rarely told his students about the war unless they asked directly, and even then, he spoke about it carefully, focusing on the lessons about focus and precision rather than the details of combat. Some of his former fellow soldiers visited him over the years, men who wanted to reconnect with someone who understood what they had been through, who could talk about the war without judgment or misunderstanding. They would sit in his study, surrounded by his medical books and his archery equipment, and they would share stories and memories, laughing about the absurdities of military life and falling silent when the conversation touched on darker subjects. These veterans all remembered the night when the mocked medical officer had killed 7 German sergeants with his bow, and they told him that his actions that night had become legendary, that new soldiers were still hearing the story years later, that he had become a symbol of how courage and skill could overcome mockery and doubt. Over the next 3 hours, the young medical officer moved through the chaos of the nighttime battle like a shadow. He used the darkness and the confusion to his advantage, stalking German soldiers who had infiltrated the British position, picking them off one by one with arrows that killed silently and gave no warning to their comrades. He found a German sergeant directing a small group of infantry toward a British ammunition depot, and he put an arrow through the sergeant's back before the Germans even knew he was there. He found another sergeant trying to cut communication lines, and he shot him from 30 yards away, a distance that should have been impossible to achieve accurately in the darkness, but which his years of practice made routine. Each kill was quick and silent, and each time the medical officer retrieved his arrows and moved on to the next target. He felt as though he were outside his own body, watching himself perform these actions, unable to quite believe that this was really happening. The bow that everyone had mocked, the weapon they had called useless and outdated, was proving to be perfectly suited for this kind of close-quarters nighttime combat. Unlike rifles that flashed and roared with each shot, revealing the shooter's position to every enemy within sight, the bow was silent and invisible. The Germans could not understand what was killing their sergeants, could not identify where the attacks were coming from, and their confusion added to the chaos that was already disrupting their assault. By the time dawn began to break over the desert, the German attack had failed. The infiltrators had been killed or driven back, and the British position held firm. As the soldiers counted their dead and assessed the damage, stories began to spread about the mysterious figure who had moved through the camp during the battle, killing German sergeants with some kind of silent weapon. Some soldiers claimed they had seen a man with a bow, but others dismissed this as confusion or shock, arguing that no one would be foolish enough to bring a bow to a modern battle. But when the bodies of the German sergeants were examined, the truth became undeniable. 7 of them bore wounds that could only have been made by arrows, and all 7 had been killed with remarkable precision, struck in vital areas by someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. When the British officers began investigating who was responsible for these kills, the trail led inevitably to the young medical officer. At first, his superiors did not know how to respond. He had violated the protocols for medical personnel, who were supposed to remain non-combatants, focused solely on treating the wounded. He had taken up arms and actively participated in combat, something that technically could result in serious disciplinary action. But the 7 German sergeants he had killed represented a significant portion of the enemy's leadership during the attack, and his actions had clearly contributed to the British victory. Without his intervention, the German infiltrators might have succeeded in destroying key supplies or killing important officers, potentially leading to a catastrophic defeat. The other soldiers' reaction was even more dramatic. The same men who had mocked his bow just days earlier now looked at him with awe and respect. They wanted to know how he had learned to shoot like that, where he had gotten his bow, whether he could teach them to use similar weapons. The mockery had completely disappeared, replaced by genuine admiration for a man who had proven that skill and courage mattered more than technology. Word of his feat spread throughout the British forces in North Africa, and soldiers who had never met him knew the story of the medical officer who killed 7 German sergeants in 3 days with nothing but a bow and arrows. The young man himself struggled with what he had done. In quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he felt the weight of those 7 lives he had taken. He had become a doctor to save people, to heal wounds, to fight against death itself. But the war had forced him into a position where killing had been necessary to protect his fellow soldiers, to prevent greater losses, to serve the cause he believed in. He spoke with the unit chaplain about his conflicted feelings, about the guilt that gnawed at him, despite knowing his actions had been justified. The chaplain listened with understanding and told him that war forced good men to do terrible things, that the measure of a person was not whether they killed, but why they killed, and how they carried the burden afterward. This conversation brought some comfort, though the young medical officer knew he would never forget those nights in the desert, would never forget the faces of the men who fell to his arrows. After that fateful night, the young medical officer's role in the war changed in subtle but significant ways. His superiors, recognizing that his unique skills could be valuable in certain situations, gave him permission to carry his bow during operations, though they emphasized that his primary duty remained medical care. He was not to seek out combat or take unnecessary risks, but if situations arose where his bow could make a difference, he was authorized to use it. This arrangement satisfied everyone involved, allowing him to continue his medical work while acknowledging that in the chaos of war, the line between healer and fighter sometimes blurred in ways no one could predict. He continued to practice with his bow whenever he had free time, maintaining his skills and crafting new arrows to replace the ones he had used. Other soldiers would sometimes watch him practice, no longer mocking, but genuinely interested in this ancient weapon that had proven so effective. A few asked him to teach them, and he obliged when he could, showing them the basics of archery, though he knew that achieving real proficiency would take years of dedicated practice that they did not have. He told them stories about his grandfather, about learning to shoot in the English forests, about the philosophy behind archery that emphasized patience and precision, and the importance of hitting your target with the first shot because you might not get a second chance. The bow saw action several more times during his service in North Africa, though never again with the dramatic results of that first night. There were occasions when he used it to silently eliminate enemy sentries so that British patrols could move safely. Times when he provided covering fire during medical evacuations. Moments when the silent nature of his weapon proved advantageous in ways that rifles could not match. Each time he drew his bow in combat, he thought of his grandfather and wondered what his old man would think of how his teachings had been applied. He liked to believe his grandfather would have been proud, not of the killing itself, but of the skill and discipline required to use the weapon effectively, and of the lives his actions had helped save. The campaign in North Africa dragged on through months of brutal fighting under the merciless desert sun. The young medical officer treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, working in field hospitals that were little more than tents set up in the sand, operating under conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. He amputated limbs destroyed by shrapnel, treated burns from exploding vehicles, and stitched together wounds that should have been fatal, and held the hands of dying men who called out for their mothers in their final moments. The work was exhausting and emotionally devastating, but he pushed through because he knew that every life he saved was a victory against the darkness of war. His reputation as both a skilled doctor and a capable fighter spread throughout the British Eighth Army. Soldiers who were wounded felt fortunate if they ended up under his care because they knew he would do everything possible to save them. And soldiers who fought alongside him felt safer knowing that this quiet man with his strange bow was watching their backs, ready to use his unique skills if the situation demanded it. He never spoke about the Germans he had killed, never boasted about his accomplishments, and deflected praise by pointing out that many other men had shown far greater courage and made far greater sacrifices than he had. The tide of the Desert War eventually turned in favor of the Allies. British and Commonwealth forces, later joined by American troops, pushed the Germans back across North Africa in a series of hard-fought victories. The young medical officer participated in this advance, moving with his unit from one battlefield to the next, setting up field hospitals in captured towns, and continuing his dual role as healer and occasional warrior. He saw the worst that war had to offer, witnessed death and suffering on a scale that defied comprehension, and yet he never lost his fundamental humanity or his commitment to helping others. The bow that had once been mocked became a symbol of his character, a reminder that unconventional approaches could sometimes succeed where traditional methods failed, and that underestimating someone based on appearances was a dangerous mistake. When the North African campaign finally ended in Allied victory, the young medical officer was among the many soldiers rotated back to England for rest and recuperation.